come one, come all to the greatest show on YouTube about the 8 and 16-bit era Sega consoles, Zilog and Moto. On this channel, you'll see weekly review videos for every English language release for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X, where I look at not only the game itself, but take a thorough look at the package and try to illuminate some historical information about the titles as well. If this sounds interesting to you at all, I heartily recommend you subscribe so you'll be notified about new video releases, because I'll be honest, I'm not the best at being a reliable poster. I see these big channels out there and they have these details in the channel description about new videos every Monday and Friday, and I'm just confounded as to how they pull that off. And then I remember, oh yeah, they're doing this professionally and not trying to wrap around a 45-hour work week. Must be nice. Anyway, enough grumbling and envy about that lack of free time. Let's actually pull the curtain back on how the game selection process works for the channel. I've talked about this a little bit in previous videos, so if you want to skip ahead, you won't hurt my feelings. But there is a little bit of a story here. I've got a list of about 1,275 games that I'm targeting for review, all told, and amongst those 4 consoles, when you break down the number of games for each console in that list, it works out that if I evenly cover them, I need to have a 4-week schedule that consists of 2 Genesis games, a Master System game, and then a slot for either a Sega CD or a 32X game. And I think having that balance is important. I don't like covering the same console all the time. As a result, this week was my Master System slot for the month, and originally I had teased the game I'd picked out for in last week's video for Space Invaders 91, and then followed up that with a Twitter post for that title, Ghost House, and I joked that I should have held it out for a Halloween video. Well, the great thing about Twitter is you get feedback, and every now and then it's positive. Through the Twitters, I've gotten connected with Jenovi, a guy who runs a great YouTube channel himself. You should go check it out, and it's 100 times larger than mine. No, seriously, go look and subscribe. It is 100 times larger than mine. Anyway, Jenovi, who's been really supportive the last few weeks, responded and said, yeah, you should do that. And trying to time video games to the time of the year is something I regularly do when making the schedule. And I thought about it, and I'd already written about 40% of the script, but it did make more sense to hold off. So thanks to Jenovi, I'm going with bait and switch, you loyal viewers, and instead we're going to look at another wildly different Master System title that's still somewhat timely, in Bomberade. Bomberade was one of 4 titles in the United States, along with also Rampage, which we looked at way back in episode 13, Cyborg Hunter, and Galaxy Force, that were all published by Activision. Yes, that same Activision that California is suing because they're more toxic than a certain Avenger. But back then, they were a wildly different company, and Bomberade was released in January of 1989 in the United States, a year before Activision began its fall to the dark side with the start of the Bobby Kotick era. If I had any Photoshop skills, I'd try to edit this picture to make him look evil, but I don't think it needs it. He already looks like a troll. And I apologize to any actual trolls that are insulted by that connotation. Okay, enough silliness. So what is Bomberade, and is it worth your time? Well, honestly, I don't know because I've never played it, but we're going to find out. First, though, our traditional look at the package. And this is Bomberade, and as you can immediately see, there's going to be a few confusing things about this game. Before we get to any of that, though, the condition. Admittedly, this one is in somewhat rough shape, but it could be worse, and I was able to clean it up a bit. Starting with the outer cover to the clamshell, and that's definitely seen some better days, with a lot of surface scuffing and scratches, to the point of opening up a few holes in the spine and near the top of the back. Not quite sure how this got roughed up like this, but I'm assuming it must have been kept around non-games, something with some sharp edges. And to add insult to injury, the hang tab has been hacked off at the top, and I do mean hacked. This isn't a smooth excision at all. Finally, the inner cover must have gotten moved around a lot, and I'm assuming it's related to whatever caused this surface damage on the spine, as we got some edge wear to the top and bottom of the inner cover where it slid out and wasn't being protected properly. But even with all that, the actual inner cover is held up well, with no sun bleaching or water damage that I can tell. So that's nice at least. As far as the front of that inner cover goes, we've got an interesting setup here. Activision, for their Master System releases, went with the cross-hatching format that Sega had started, but tweaked the colors on each of the 4 releases, with Rampage getting red, Galaxy Force getting silver, and both Bomber Raid and Cyborg Hunter getting black. At the time of release, Bomber Raid having this black cover was cool, and it was a nice change of pace from all the other white Sega releases, as is a good way to signify that this was a rare third-party release for the console. However, the Genesis would debut 8 months later in September with, a black cross-hatching design, making you really have to pay attention to whether this was a Master System title or a Genesis title. I've actually been in several retro shops where they've mistakenly placed these Master System Activision titles in with Genesis games, so even that those that are in the know, so to speak, can be tripped up as well. As far as the cover art goes, this is pretty cool. It's a picture of an SR-71 Blackbird dropping some bombs, so pretty appropriate with the name anyway. However, as we'll get to in a minute, from a game perspective, they probably should have gone with something different. And the classic rainbow Activision logo, used going back to the Atari 2600, is present on the front, spine, and back, leaving no mistake that this is an Activision title. On that rear cover, and hey, I like this. Well, the screenshots anyway, as there's 5 of them, and they're all of decent quality from the era. The flavor text is a bit cringier and very 80s, but I have to respect them for trying something different. Although, I'm sure some parents back then probably weren't too happy with the "send a missile up his tailpipe" line. Opening the package up, and the cartridge does have the traditional red label, but it does look slightly different, and Activision got their logo in there as well. The manual's in pretty good shape, and looks a bit more like a traditional Master System manual, with the blue on white. The manual itself is a bit lame and contains no screenshots. I guess they used them all up on the rear cover. It explains how to play the game, but doesn't do a whole lot else, and doesn't even have a high score page at the end. Something that it seemed like all Master System games had at that point, whether they needed it or not. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game, and hopefully it'll have some higher production values than the manual. Before going into detail about Bomber Raid, just a few notes about playing the game. If you're emulating, you can probably ignore all this, but if you're playing on original hardware, and you want to give Bomber Raid a shot, you may run into some of these things. Bomber Raid is on the list of games that's floating around places like Sega Retro or SMS Power, where if you want to play the game, you have to use a Master System controller and not a Genesis controller. So far, I hadn't run into this situation, even when playing Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego a few episodes in episode 113, which is also on this list. But Bomber Raid definitely appears to have this issue, as I had to use a Master System pad to play the game. No big deal, and while I'm sure the game would play better with a turbo-enabled controller like the SG Commander or the Honeybee, I don't have one of those yet, so a regular MS pad it is. But I definitely think I'll be on the lookout for a Honeybee after this, just in case. However, what really threw me was that Bomber Raid doesn't appear to work on a Genesis with a power-based converter, which is how I normally play these games. I did a quick search and only turned up the controller issue, so not exactly sure what's going on there, as the only games I knew that didn't work were F-16 Fighting Falcon and the Codemasters titles that require a Master System 2 for whatever reason. As a result, the footage you're looking at now is being recorded from an original Master System using an original Master System pad, so I apologize in advance for any jail bars, as my Master System is just stock and not running an RGB bypass mod. Now that those technical details are out of the way, let's get to the game. In December of 1982, Activision released one of the greatest games on the Atari 2600, River Raid, an endless vertical shooter where your goal is to fly a plane down a river, taking out enemies while avoiding land and also slowing down for the occasional refuel to keep you in the air. I spent untold hours playing River Raid as a kid. Even though you couldn't technically beat it, it was still fun to play over and over to try to get a high score. River Raid was so popular it inspired a direct sequel and ports to many other 8-bit consoles and computers of the era. I bring this up because before eventually being titled Bomber Raid, the game was originally designed with two other possible titles in mind, Battle Wings and Super River Raid. However, at some point in 1988 before release, Activision decided that the game was different enough from the previous River Raid games so that Super River Raid wasn't appropriate, and instead we got Bomber Raid, which still gave a tip of the hat to the previous titles. Also, fun fact, Battle Wings isn't just a rumored alternate title, there's also a cheat code that can be entered that shows the original development title screen with the alternate name. I'd rather have a cheat code for more lives or power-ups, but it's still cool nonetheless. Retitling the game was probably the best course of action because about the only thing tying this game to the original River Raid is that you're flying a similar World War II style plane, and that you happen to be flying over water. Sometimes. Yeah, that cool SR-71 Blackbird from the cover of the game? Well, there's usually a few small enemy planes that resemble it that show up right before the boss in each level, but they're somewhat blink and you miss it. Not sure why Activision decided it would be a good choice for the cover, given that they're barely in the game, but the Japanese release from Sega is definitely much more representative of the actual game, while still being a great looking cover. Like River Raid, Bomber Raid is a vertical shooter. However, rather than just an unending string of enemies to avoid and destroy while you try to set a high score, Bomber Raid has 5 defined levels, each with bosses at the end that are called out at the beginning of the level. Rather than River Raid, Bomber Raid is closer in nature to Capcom's classic 19XX series of World War II inspired vertical shooters, and actually, Bomber Raid does a good job of filling that niche on the Master System, with those titles stuck in Nintendo development contract hell at the time. Even though Bomber Raid is a vertical shooter, it's played in standard 4x3 screen orientation, meaning that the screen is wider than it is tall. Most home console vertical shooters at the time went with this screen layout, rather than a screen that was taller than it was wide, just due to the limited resolution available on standard definition televisions. Pixel real estate was extremely valuable, and cutting off part of the screen on the sides just didn't make sense in most cases, as it would require smaller, less detailed sprites to be used on the screen. Thankfully, with the action on screen moving near continuously from top to bottom, there's usually enough time to prepare for oncoming enemies without the game seeming unfair. However, that's not to say that the game isn't hard. It is. In fact, during my time playing the game this week, I was only able to make it to the third boss. The problem is the game's difficulty relies a little too much on the power-up system. The power-up system from a contextual perspective isn't bad, and I actually like how it's designed. As you make your way through a level, you'll run across these flashing UFO-like ships amongst all the more traditional aircrafts, ships, tanks, and turrets. These UFO thingies are actually called power pods, according to the manual, and when you shoot them, one of two things will happen. Either they'll drop a power-up for you to try to collect, or they'll turn into an enemy that you'll have to avoid or shoot again before it takes you out. The power-ups come in one of 3 flavors. Shot power-ups, where if you grab enough of them, the guns you fire will do more damage, and this can be repeated to get a more and more powerful shot. Speed power-ups, where each one you collect makes your plane move around the screen faster. And finally, red numbered power-ups that you can shoot in the air to change that number before grabbing it. This is probably the most interesting power-up, as depending on which number, 1 through 4 is on the token, it will add an additional smaller jet to your left, and based on the value of that number, it will either position itself diagonally ahead and to the left, directly left, diagonally behind and to the left, and finally directly behind you. After collecting that first token, if you can manage to keep yourself and that support ship alive, you can collect a second support ship to fly in those same locations to your right. The support ship is good in theory and has been pulled off well in other titles. Unfortunately, I think the Bomber Raid developers got a little too cute for their own good. The problem is, due to the direction the support ships shoot,
90% of the time, any position except for the number 2 position, diagonally ahead, is totally useless. Number 1 and 4 positions, directly to the side and directly behind, both fire horizontally, and the number 3 position, diagonally behind, fires in that same direction. Now, I don't know about you, but I know when I'm playing a vertical shooter and I'm trying to take out enemies coming from the top of the screen, about the absolutely least useful thing I could think of is having help shooting behind me. And not even directly behind me. Oh no, that would be too easy. Diagonally behind me. Yikes. Sometimes things about video games are unique because other people have the good sense not to do them. This problematic support system, combined with the fact that unless you've been able to power up your guns at least 3 times, because certain enemies take far too long to kill otherwise, really hamper what could have been a truly great shooter. In a more positive regard, the graphics in Bomber Raid are pretty good. It's certainly not the best looking Master System game I've ever seen, but for a 2 megabit title, it's solid. While some enemies are shared amongst levels, others are unique, giving a nice variety to the action, and they're all decently drawn. And while there's a lot of similar backgrounds to the levels, with a lot of brown, green, and blue interspersed, there's definitely a different feel to them, so you're never left with a feeling of, oh, this section again. When the action gets particularly hectic, there can be some slowdown in the levels, or line flickering if too many enemies get in the same area of the screen, but this isn't too common, and for the most part, the game performs well. In fact, there's been plenty of times when I died due to having a few speed power-ups stored up, and accidentally moved too fast into something I didn't expect to hit. Also, I like the relatively large bosses. They're imposing and intimidating, with the Master System doing its best to bring the feel of the arcades home to the player. Bomber Raid is one of the Master System games that not only has a standard soundtrack, but also has an available soundtrack to use with the FM add-on. And just like for every other FM soundtrack-enabled game that I've played so far, you're not really missing anything major if you don't have the equipment to play it. The background music definitely does sound better with the FM version, but the sound effects just end up being too noisy, and I prefer the regular ones. Your mileage may vary on this, and if you do have the ability to give the FM soundtrack a shot, you definitely should, but I certainly wouldn't expect an amazing difference. Both soundscapes fit the game well, and while the sounds and music are all relatively simple, they're certainly not bad, and don't detract from the experience. All in all, I enjoyed my time with Bomber Raid, and it was a nice change of pace from the last few games I reviewed for the channel. It does have some clear flaws, and things that are frustrating, but Senritsu was nice enough to include infinite continues, and I could definitely see someone, especially someone who's good at these types of games, being able to beat the game with enough time. Anytime I actually have fun with a game on this channel, it's probably going to get at least 3 stars, and that's the case here. I'll definitely be looking into picking up one of the aforementioned Master System controllers with a turbo function, and pulling this one back out just for fun. If you're a shooter fan, give Bomber Raid a look. I think you'll have a good time.
Okay, that was Bomber Raid, pinch hitting at the last minute for Ghost House this week. Beavis and Butthead said it best, that you have to have things that suck to know other things were cool. And that's been my experience this week with Bomber Raid versus the last 3 weeks of games. I've got a sneaking suspicion that I'm not going to like Ghost House nearly as much as I like Bomber Raid, so this was probably a good substitution in the schedule, just for my sanity. Next week on Zilog and Moto, something completely different, especially since the last 2 weeks have ended up being vertical shooters. Instead, something with a bit more strategy on the Sega CD, and a game that I'll readily admit I'm not good at because I'm simply not patient enough. It's a game that you may not be aware of, as it flew a bit under the radar, but it features a licensed property you definitely know, and maybe love, I don't know. It seems like people are kind of split on that these days. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.